Good day, everyone, and welcome to the Public Relations Society of America Crisis Communication Certificate Program. I'm Helio Fred Garcia, the curator of the program, and I was the presenter in last week's opening module. Welcome to module number 2, Obtaining Public Forgiveness, with Adam Tiaririan and Brian Shevlin. Before we begin, just a couple of administrative notes. The first is that the audio and slides from last week's module have been posted on the community site, and you're invited to go back and re-listen to any part of it that you might have missed or want to listen to again. Or if by chance you weren't able to participate live last week, you have an opportunity to listen and watch the entire module in its entirety. Also, at the end of the first module, we were not able to take all of the questions that have been asked. And despite some setbacks in my travel schedule and health, we have been able to post the answers to those questions on the community site. My apologies for the delay. You can see those answers at the community site. With that, I'm delighted to introduce Adam Tiaririan, who's a senior fellow in the Logos Institute for Crisis Management and Executive Leadership, and Brian Shevlin, who is an attorney who serves as a senior vice president and chief general counsel of Pernod Ricard USA. With that, let me invite Adam to take the ball. Adam.
Thank you very much, Fred, and thanks to all of you who are joining this second module in the PRSA Crisis Communication Certificate Program on obtaining public forgiveness. I've gotten a chance to look back at some of the discussions you've had during the first module, and we're going to talk today about something that some of you asked about, something that no doubt many of you have thought about in your roles as the people who safeguard the reputations of your organizations, and those are moments when we need to obtain public forgiveness. First, a little bit more on my background, the work that we're here for today, the work that many of you do every day, and the work that Fred and I do at Logos, and that Brian is involved in as a general counsel, is the work of high-stakes communication. And my role involves sometimes doing high-stakes communication as a sports public address announcer for events of between 5,000 and 20,000 people. That's mostly a hobby, and thankfully I've never had to apologize in those circumstances. I also study high-stakes communication. I was the language analyst for Bloomberg Politics coverage of the 2016 presidential election, and I do quantitative language analysis. So I can tell you quantitatively that it was the weirdest talking presidential election in American history. That's not a political judgment, but a quantitative one. And politics is a realm where high-stakes apologies abound. But I spend most of my time not doing or studying high-stakes communication, rather advising and teaching high-stakes communication in situations just like this with leaders like you from around the world and across the country with Fred and my colleagues at Logos. I know that we have folks joining us from Alaska to Florida, California to Maine. We may have a Hawaii in there somewhere. So thank you very much for taking the time this afternoon. I look forward to being with you, to sharing some time with Brian Shevlin, who is General Counsel of Pernod Ricard USA, and a perfect complement to the work we're going to do on communication today in terms of achieving what's necessary to obtain public forgiveness within the organizational structures that we all live in. So we're going to focus on 3 things today. First, we're going to understand the concept of forgiveness and understand when it is necessary. Second, we're going to understand what makes an apology effective. And one of the things that you'll take away is that an apology is just one ingredient of forgiveness, and an apology itself has numerous components. And third, we'll understand the organizational considerations for making it happen. Just as many of the people and communicators we advise who ask us about what makes an apology effective also ask us about how they can actually convince their organization to put an apology into action when it is needed. And so that third topic will really focus on some of the organizational considerations for making it happen, and we'll get even more insight from our guest, Brian Shevlin, on that topic. Again, I know there are many of you joining us, almost 200 on the call now. I want all of you to feel fully free to engage at every moment. So you have a chat box, a Q&A box. There are times when I'm going to ask you questions, and I'll ask you to type your responses in that box. And at any time, I encourage you to ask me and Brian questions. Again, type your questions in that box. Same chat box, whether you're answering a question from me or asking a question to me and Brian. If anything comes to mind, don't hold back. Get into that chat box. We'll be monitoring it and look forward to engaging with you throughout the next 90 minutes. So let's dive in and understand when forgiveness is necessary. And for that, let's reset and put ourselves into the context that you learned in the first module of this crisis communication certificate program. You learned what may have been a new way to think about what a crisis is and how to respond. And that new way comes from ultimately a very old way. The root of the very word crisis in English comes from the Greek krisis. And you heard from Fred how that wasn't just a bad thing. It was a turning point, a moment when a protagonist needed to make a fateful decision. And how they chose would define their destiny. So if we take seriously that old meaning of crisis or krisis in the ancient Greek, you learned in the last module that it gives us a new way of understanding crisis management. Not as spin or damage control or rumor management, but as the management of decisions that are made at a turning point. The kind of turning point like in ancient Greek tragedy where your destiny can go one way or the other. In a moment, I'll ask you a question based on the decision criterion that Fred offered for how to manage those decisions at a turning point. And that's the defining question. If we ask the wrong questions, we'll get the wrong answers. Questions like, what do we do or what do we say? But if we ask the right questions, we can get the right answer about how to make the right decision at one of those turning points. And you've already learned that question about what would reasonable people appropriately expect a responsible organization to do in this situation. So here's the question I now have for you. You can get ready in that Q&A chat box, and I'd love to hear your answers. What are the kinds of situations when reasonable people would appropriately expect a responsible organization to seek forgiveness? What are the kinds of situations when reasonable people would appropriately expect a responsible organization to seek forgiveness? Go ahead and type your answers in the chat box now. I hear from Thomas, when someone is injured. Joe says when airplane software caused a crash, and you may be referring to current events. Illegally sharing your personal photo when customer information is compromised. When an organization lets down its customers when clearly at fault. Any at-fault situation, really, says Cassie. Rachel says, I work in a museum, and those situations might include even when artwork is offensive. And Mark gives us a general case. So we hear a bunch of really interesting specific examples. Some of you, like Rachel, may be drawing from your own experience. Some of you may be drawing from current events, like when airplane software causes fatalities. If we try to divine, what do all of those examples have in common? It gets close to the definition that Mark offered. something about causing harm. Here's the way that we can think about it, aligned with what you learned in your last module. That forgiveness is necessary when there are actual victims of an organization's action or inaction. I want to take a few moments to discuss each of these lines. The first is necessary. In these situations, it is impossible for an organization to return to business as usual without earning forgiveness. And when an organization fails to earn forgiveness in a situation like this, it has lasting and permanent damage. You heard about BP in the last module. Let's talk about actual victims, which is a phrase that can spark a lot of potential debate. Some of you have raised what are the most obvious cases of someone being a victim of an organization's action or inaction. And those are cases when there is direct physical harm. There's then the question of fault and whether the organization is at fault for that harm. And finally, there's a question of victims who are not the victims of physical harm, but some other harm. So let's go back to Rachel's example of when artwork is offensive in a museum. The key to determine what is an actual victim is to return back to the defining question about what reasonable people would expect from a responsible organization. And ask yourself, among the people who matter to you, which could be very different groups for different people listening, among the people who matter to you, would reasonable people perceive this person or these people as victims of the organization's action or inaction? The key is not to default to your own personal preference, they shouldn't be offended, so therefore I'm not going to treat them as though they were victims of that offense. But rather to ask from the perspective of reasonable people among the stakeholders who matter to you. And that in part answers the question that Morgan Roth has just asked, what about perceived inaction? Not of an organization's action or inaction, but of perceived inaction. Morgan, if I understand you correctly, you're saying there might be a situation where an organization took a responsible action, but was perceived not to. In that case, since we don't have the action or inaction, if your judgment is correct, that the action that you did take, or that the organization did take, I should say, fulfills the expectations of reasonable people, then all that's left to do is communicate it. However, it's possible that an organization takes an action, but fails to publicize the action or make others aware of it. For example, take the example of compromised personal data. It's possible for the organization to take the action to set up credit monitoring for those affected, which is an appropriate thing to do. But if they don't do a good enough job of making sure that everyone affected knows about this available credit monitoring, then that itself is an example of inaction. They didn't take the necessary action to get this credit monitoring to the people who needed it. And those people who didn't get the credit monitoring they needed are now actual victims of the organization's inaction. So Morgan, in the situation you're talking about with respect to perceived inaction, think of two possible cases. One is when the action really was responsible and already done, and simply just needs to be communicated. But the other is there could be a case where there's an even larger inaction, which is the failure to make others aware of the action that the organization took in response. But always return to that defining question about what would reasonable people expect a responsible organization to do. And Maria, I'll give you the same response. In the example of museum, it depends on your target. A lot of people would feel that showing a piece of art is defending freedom of expression, and that's exactly the kind of debate that you can get into about this question. There are organizations, even in the very recent past, who have apologized for creating offense on one side of especially a politically divisive issue, and then apologize for the apology in order to placate the other side of that politically divisive issue. These are difficult questions, and we're going to dig deeper into how to answer them. over the course of the next 60 or so minutes. So for Maria, the question of depending on your target, to me, sounds like depending on your stakeholders. And the museum should ask, among the people who matter to them, what would reasonable people expect a responsible organization to do? There are people who may be offended by the level of nudity in Roman classical art, but a Roman classical art museum probably doesn't count those people among those who matter to the museum. However, a museum might be surprised by someone being offended by something with a racial undertone that they didn't anticipate. And as long as all races matter to that museum, then they need to think really carefully about what reasonable people in all of those stakeholder groups would expect. As we build from the concept of expectations, we can define these situations when forgiveness is necessary, when there are victims and when those victims result from an organization's action or inaction. Again, there is still judgment to make, but let's accept this as the general framework for when forgiveness is necessary. The remarkable thing is that not only can forgiveness be necessary, it can also be very, very possible. And you can all think of times in your own life when you have forgiven someone. All of us have, and often we have with the people who are very closest to us. The same is true for organizations. You may even be able to think of a time when you've forgiven an organization. Ronald Alsop, the business columnist of the Wall Street Journal, in the year directly after two of the biggest corporate scandals in American history, Enron and WorldCom, for which executives are still in jail today, wrote that Americans tend to be forgiving when companies confess their sins and do their penance. We're going to get closer to that statement in just a few minutes. But for most companies, honesty and sincerity have been sorely lacking. Part of the failures of Enron and WorldCom were, first of all, that they did really, really bad things. But then also it took them and their advisors too long to own up to those things, to confess their sins and do their penance. Now, a crisis or a misdeed, the scale of Enron and WorldCom, may truly be unrecoverable in a fundamental sense. But let's think about the much smaller instances where a simple, effective response quickly, going back to what you learned in the first module, could have earned forgiveness. And there are 4 steps that every organization who needs to earn forgiveness should follow. This is what it means to confess sins and do penance. We don't have to be quite so religious about it. We can translate it into a business framework. And here are the 4 steps. First, the organization has to stop doing whatever is causing the harm. This seems obvious, but some organizations skip this step. And organizations who skip this step are rightly called out for hypocrisy when they do the following steps and not the first step. Second step is to say you're sorry. And we're going to talk in much more detail in just a couple of minutes about the elements of an effective apology. Saying just the word sorry isn't enough. It's necessary, but not enough. And we're going to talk about the other elements that make an apology effective. Third, of course, don't do it again. Again, organizations can get steps 1 and 2 right, but then step 3 wrong, and totally undermine all the progress they may have made in steps 1 and 2. And finally, step 4, to remedy the harm that was caused. It's possible to do, for example, steps 1, 2, and 3 right, and still leave a particular stakeholder group feeling rightly aggrieved because they are still, in other words, harmed by the harm that was done to them before, because you didn't make it better. Those are the 4 steps to obtaining public forgiveness. In a moment, we're going to look at a brief example. But let me answer now Nina's question. What if your organization is unfairly accused of wrongdoing? I'll orient you back to the key defining question. What would reasonable people appropriately expect a responsible organization to do? And the key is to understand that word unfairly, not from your own perspective, but from the perspective of the people who matter to you. If you're defining yourself as unfairly accused because it feels unfair to you, then you're bound to make bad decisions, self-protective decisions, avoidant decisions, the kinds of decisions that can cause lasting damage. However, if you make the judgment that you're unfairly accused because reasonable people among those who matter to you perceive the accusation as unfair, then that's the time to give a more measured response or no response at all. Good afternoon, this is Adam. In just a minute, I will explain to you exactly how to apologize perfectly for a technical difficulty like that. Can you confirm in the chat box whether you can hear me? Just need one or two people. Great, thanks William, Rebecca, Jen. All right, looks like we're back online. Let's get back rocking and rolling. And like I said, I'm gonna use this as the example for how to execute an effective apology. So in that effective apology, I'll tell you what just happened and why it happened and a couple of other things that will all be a lesson for you on effective apologies. Let's now turn to an example. We established 4 main elements for obtaining public forgiveness. First, to stop doing what's causing the harm. And again, this seems obvious, but some organizations can miss it. Second, to say that you're sorry and to do this well. We're going to explain that in just a few minutes. Third, not to do it again because you'll be rightly charged with hypocrisy if you do. And fourth, to make it better, to not forget the people who were harmed in the first place, because if you don't make it better for them, then they're still harmed by the initial action or inaction. And now let's go back to school season. Some of you out there may have small children, may have done back to school shopping recently. Let me ask you, for the most part, who does back to school shopping? Go ahead and type your answer in the chat box. Parents, grandparents, small children, anybody else, who does back to school shopping? Teachers often do, great. Gigi says mom, always mom. So I think that's an interesting point, whether they're teachers or moms, whether this is the way it should be or not. Let me just ask you, from a marketing perspective, if you're an organization looking at the customers who come into your store for back to school shopping, what is the gender identity of the majority of back to school shoppers? Yep, as a matter of analysis, female, overwhelmingly as a majority of back to school shoppers. So let's go to JCPenney, which in 2011, as I told you, was going through one of its many ups and downs of the 2000s. It's in fact still going through ups and downs. It's a retailer in a competitive environment where other retailers are comparable to JCPenney and close by, often in the same mall. And still other retailers now, like Amazon, for example, might offer a more convenient experience without ever going to the mall. And that leaves us with this up and down company that's trying to carve out a place for itself in the market. And it knows that there is only one time of the year after the Christmas shopping season that matters most for making their numbers, and that is back to school. And it knows that many shoppers in the back to school season, the majority of shoppers are female, so it's going to target a new product to young girls. In the tops and tees section, here's the product. For girls ages 7 to 16, the title of the product is Too Pretty to Do Homework. It's a top or tee. And I ask, who has time for homework when there's a new Justin Bieber album out? She'll love this new tee that's just as cute and sassy as she is. And the shirt reads, "I'm too pretty to do homework, so my brother has to do it for me." So let me ask you, what would reasonable people appropriately expect a responsible organization to do in this situation? And in particular, is this the kind of situation when they're actual victims of an organization's action or inaction, or in other words, the kind of situation where forgiveness is required? Go ahead and post your responses in the chat box. What would reasonable people expect a responsible organization to do? And does that include seeking forgiveness? Renelda and Camille say, "Stop selling the item, pull the shirt." Most of you are arriving at one of two responses, or some of you arriving like Amy Power at both of them, which is to pull the product and to apologize. To pull the product and to apologize. Notice that those were two elements that we talked about in terms of obtaining public forgiveness, to say you're sorry and to stop doing what's causing harm. Those were number one and number two. Let's see how JCPenney responded. In a moment, I'm going to show a video. So let me ask you who watched that video, and if you weren't able to see it or hear it, you'll be able to access a YouTube link to that video in the slides on the online community after this session. For those who did see and hear it, how did JCPenney do relative to the expectations that you set out? Did they do well or poorly with respect to meeting stakeholders' expectations? Well, very well, did a good job. And I agree with those of you who said exactly that. Not only did they meet the expectations, as a couple of you have noted, they met the expectations quickly, and in particular, those expeditiously, as Raphael says. And those expectations also included the expectation to earn forgiveness, including to apologize. A couple of you, when we were stating the expectations initially, when I asked you what would reasonable people expect, some of you said, make a commitment to show how committed they are to the education of young girls. You can imagine that if JCPenney had failed to act quickly, had failed to respond and respond quickly in a way that met expectations, the expectations would have ratcheted up, as you learned about when you learned about the golden hour in the first module. So you could imagine that on day 2 or 3, there might be an expectation to make an alternative shirt with an alternative message, or to donate to an organization that advances young women's education. But because JCPenney responded so quickly, the expectations were relatively small or constrained. And again, you can connect that to the golden hour that you saw in Module 1. But I want to go back to the topic of forgiveness that we're discussing here today. Notice the social media comments that the CBS Early Show highlighted. And in particular, each of them included a special little word, and that is the word if. My daughters and I will shop elsewhere if you continue to market this nonsense. So the idea is that the continued trust of the people who matter to JCPenney is conditional, It's not that because they released this shirt, they've lost the trust of the people who matter to them. It's because they released this shirt, the people who matter to them are watching more closely to see if JCPenney will earn their forgiveness. And if JCPenney stops marketing this nonsense, in the words of that Facebook comment, then they can maintain the trust of the people who matter to them. Stephen raises a really interesting point that we're going to cover in just a moment. Stephen says they could have said how they were planning to change the process to prevent shirts like this from being sold by JCPenney in the future. That's one ingredient of an effective apology. And if they were to do this even better, they might have included every one of those ingredients, which I'm about to share with you. And Stephen's example is a perfect case of someone who doesn't hear a specific thing in an apology and then may not hear the apology fully if it doesn't have that one element. So with that, let's turn to our second objective: understanding what makes an apology effective. Some of you may have heard of the 5 love languages. Believe it or not, you're hearing about them in this call. If you've heard about them before, bonus points if you can type a few of them in the chat box. But the 5 love languages, things like giving gifts or physical affection, words of affirmation, Linda says, acts of service, Nikki reminds us. These are all classification by psychologists of how people in interpersonal romantic relationships give and receive love. In a minute, you'll see exactly where I'm going with this, because what's interesting about that research, and it is rigorous research, is that people give and receive love in different ways, and the psychologists argue one of the most powerful things that a committed couple or even pair of friends can do is learn each other's love languages. How do they give love? How do they receive love? For example, I'm not a gift giver. I'm not good at giving gifts. And if you give me a gift, I will appreciate it, but it's not going to make my day. And other people may really care to have gifts given to them, so that'd be something I'd need to work on. But as Carla tells us, the reason that we're bringing this in now is that the same psychologist, Gary Chapman, teamed up with another psychologist, Jennifer Thomas, to develop the 5 languages of an effective apology. And they developed these 5 languages mostly for interpersonal apologies, but if you talk to Jennifer Thomas or Gary Chapman today, Jennifer Thomas especially, will tell you how these apply in larger settings. And we at Logos believe they apply very well for public apologies or even organizational apologies that occur in private. And just like the love languages, if you don't get the one you need, then you can't hear the apology. So let me take you through all 5. And as an example, like I promised, I'll use our little technical disconnection a few minutes ago. And I will apologize to you for that disconnection. The first apology language is regret. I need to show you specific remorse. So I need to be very specific about what caused the harm. I'm sorry that I lost my connection to the call a few minutes ago, and that cost you some of your time. I need to be really specific, and this is typically where we need the inclusion of the word sorry or apologize. Some people might need to hear an acknowledgement of responsibility, something that has to do with acknowledging our mistake or what caused the harm. So my regret would be, I'm sorry that I let myself get disconnected from the call and that cost you some of your time. But my expression of responsibility might be, I've done my best to set up a private room for this call, but clearly I should have it was a mistake not to get a room that was above ground where I could have cell phone reception in case the Wi-Fi went out. So there's my expression of responsibility. Some people need to hear an expression of restitution. How are we going to make this right? So I might say, in order to make up for that lost time, I'm very happy to answer all of your questions in the online community after this session, and we'll have time for Q&A at the end of the session as well. So I need to do something proportionate to the harm to make it right. Repentance. Some people need to hear that you're going to improve. So for the next module of the PRSA certificate program in which I present, I'll make sure that I book a whole half day to stay in the office instead of traveling, and make sure that that connection problem doesn't happen again. And finally, an explicit request for forgiveness. Some people need the power transferred back to them in order to accept an apology. So here I might say, I hope that you'll all forgive me for that disconnection and look forward to the rest of this call. There are the 5 apology languages: regret, responsibility, restitution, repentance, and forgiveness. Regret is about specific remorse, usually involving the words sorry or apologize. And you're apologizing that you did something, not apologizing that something happened or apologizing if someone was offended. Responsibility, explaining what went wrong. Restitution, making amends. Repentance, fixing it so it doesn't go wrong again. That's what Stephen told us about the JCPenney shirt. They could have changed their processes. And finally, forgiveness, making an explicit request. Those are the 5 apology languages. And the big lesson is this. When you're apologizing either in public or in private to someone you don't know, so this should cover most organizational apologies, you don't know which of these apology languages they need to hear in order to accept an apology. And that means that you need all 5. This is the key takeaway of everything that we're going to discuss today. If an apology is public, that is to many people, or is private to someone you don't know, then you don't know which apology language they need in order to accept an apology, and that means that you as the organization need all 5. Let's layer on one more evaluation of apologies, and then we'll very quickly turn to organizational considerations. Kelsey asks, what's the example for restitution? Restitution, think of restitution like looking backwards, fixing the harm that was caused or making amends. So what are you going to do to remedy the harm? If I walked past your table and spilled your drink, restitution might be offering to buy you a new drink. That's restitution. And for Stephen, this idea of restitution, again, seems to be important. And again, for JCPenney, they could have done more to show restitution. I would argue that that expectation might have heightened further if they hadn't responded so quickly. Cuthbert wants to be sure I understand. Saying we regret the experience is not enough. We should include a specific we're sorry is what Cuthbert is asking. The short answer I would give you is if you've determined that the organization needs to earn forgiveness, yes, a specific we're sorry. Now, we regret the experience may be sufficient to meet expectations in a different situation where someone may have been inconvenienced but not victimized or harmed. But in a case where someone experiences actual harm, we're going to need to find a way to earn forgiveness fully, and that includes the apology language of regret, which includes the words sorry or apologize. We're going to talk much more about this with Brian in just a couple of minutes. It all goes back to this defining question. Let me give you a few cases, and here's what I want you to think about as we go through these cases. Earlier, I believe it was Camille asked, are we talking only about when we need to earn forgiveness publicly or apologize in the media? Or what about cases where that forgiveness or apology might be done in a more private way? And my answer is yes, we're talking about both. Cases where you can apologize in a narrow or private way versus cases where you can apologize publicly. It's the same basic model. What you're about to see here is that when you apologize makes a big difference to where you apologize. And if you can do it quickly, then it's more likely to be private. If it takes time, then it's more likely to be public. Let me give you 3 cases: the convenience store, the airport, and the hospital. In the convenience store, a mother and her son are shopping in Portland area Walgreens. The mother is shopping for makeup. And I have to admit, I haven't shopped for makeup many times in my life, but the way I understand that it's done is you take a makeup container or whatever it's called off the shelf. Forgive my lack of makeup expertise. And then you look at it and then you compare it to your skin tone, see how it feels, then put it back and then look at another one and look at another one and so on and so forth. And that, as I understand, is a pretty normal makeup shopping experience. That's exactly what this mother was doing. But then as she decided not to buy any makeup and left the store, she and her son were detained by the store staff and accused of shoplifting. They insisted that they hadn't shoplifted, but the store staff insisted that they sit on the floor near the entrance to the store and wait for police to arrive and investigate. They were left there for more than an hour while police responded to the call, sitting on the floor, mother and son, near the front of the store, right near the entrance, falsely accused for shoplifting. Would reasonable people expect a responsible organization to seek forgiveness in this situation? Please type your responses in the chat box. Yes, absolutely. So here are the questions I want to ask you. If we believe that the expectations include an effective apology, we know what that apology should contain, the 5 languages that we talked about. Now I need to ask you a few other questions. To whom should the apology be from? For what should it be? And from whom should it come? So to whom should the apology be? Go ahead and type in your responses. To whom should this organization apologize? To the mother and the son? Apologize to the mother and the son and potentially others who may have witnessed this interaction. Other clients, asked Anila. Great, excellent. Also potentially the witnesses, because one of the characteristics of the harm that happens to victims is that other people can empathize with them and feel the same way by observation. Renelda asked to the mother, son, and the public, asking whether it's a racial issue. The mother and her son were African American. And as we move forward here, we're going to see how that plays out. But it makes sense for the apology to be to the mother and son. For what? For what? What should the organization apologize for? Aha. So not only the false accusation, the detainment and the amount of time, and also the humiliation or embarrassment. Excellent. Excellent. You're understanding that that's the harm that was caused, and the harm wasn't just the accusation or just the waiting time. It was also this embarrassment. To name that in the apology is critical. That's part of the first language of regret. And finally, from whom should the apology come? So here it's interesting because I see a range of answers from the store manager to corporate all the way up to the CEO. And here's the way that I'd think about it. Just like we talked about with the golden hour, those expectations ratchet up over time. If the apology was immediate, then it makes perfect sense for it to be the highest ranking person in the store. And that would probably fulfill expectations. But if it took several days, then the apology would likely need to be someone from corporate. And if it took a week, then the apology might need to come from the highest levels of the company. So one thing to think about as you think about from whom an apology should come is that it can be someone close to the incident at the beginning if it's immediate, but it has to be someone very high ranking as it progresses, as the issue progresses. And in this case, Teresa White and her son sued Walgreens and won. The money is now in her son's college fund. And the really interesting thing here is that she said, if someone had just apologized, she might not have sued the company at all. So this is really interesting, and it gets us to our next topic on the organizational considerations of obtaining public forgiveness. Before we move on quickly, Angela says, even if the apology is immediate, but the issue is very socially contentious, shouldn't it be at the CEO level? Thinking, for example, of racial issues such as this. My advice to you is to go back to the 4-question test from the module 1. Ask yourself those 4 questions about whether a public response is necessary. And if so, then it may make sense for that public response to come from the CEO level. In a case like this, the detainment, while shameful and deeply offensive, took place for a relatively short period of time, so it was around an hour. It would have been possible, let's say 20 minutes in, for at the store level, someone to recognize, hey, this is wrong. I'm really sorry. And I'm sorry along with these 5 languages of apology, and let this mom and her son go in a way that wouldn't trigger expectations for a big public response. But as Lisa says, there may be social media posts or other conversation that's taking the issue public. In those cases, again, refer to the 4-question test from module 1, you may find that it's necessary to issue a more public response from a higher level. Let me give you just one more case before we move on, and that is from the airport. We'll skip the final case on the hospital. The setting is a TSA checkpoint in Corpus Christi, Texas. It's a relatively small airport, common for vacationers who are going down for the warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico. One of those vacationers is a young woman who's returning home from her trip to Corpus Christi. And she goes through the security line, is selected for one of the pat-down searches that those of you who fly often will be familiar with. And during that pat-down search, the TSA officer inadvertently lifts up her shirt and exposes this young woman to the security screening area. Here's the question. Would reasonable people appropriately expect a responsible organization to apologize in this situation? I see yeses, and again, I'll ask you, to whom should the apology be? To the traveler? And what did we learn from our last case? Yes, not just the immediate victim, but also to witnesses, other people in the screening hall. Second, for what should the apology be? What's the specific regret about? Yes, to her for violating her privacy, for not being more careful, for the embarrassment it might have caused her. And we could say similarly to the others in the hall for the potential discomfort or embarrassment that resulted from that incident. Finally, from whom should the apology come? So certainly from the TSA agent who was performing the pat down. And then we can imagine again the same escalation. It might be the agent, but if it's not immediate, like in the moment of the error, then it probably escalates to the agent's supervisor. The expectation then goes higher to the senior most officials at the airport in TSA or of the airport authority, and then higher to TSA Central. You can imagine, again, think about the case I described when I knock over your drink on the edge of the table. In that case, my apology would be immediate. Literally the moment that I brush the drink, I'd apologize, and you would do the same. Imagine, in this case, the same immediacy. The agent makes this mistake and then immediately removes her hands and says, I'm so sorry I did that. That must have been really embarrassing. It was totally a mistake. And you can imagine how then the expectation would not escalate to a higher authority. But if that TSA agent who did fail to apologize, the expectation would escalate and escalate and escalate. And fascinatingly, this person too also sued, also won a lawsuit against the TSA. And she said that she would not have filed that lawsuit if TSA officials had simply sent a letter of apology. And this brings us to our next topic, understanding the organizational considerations. I want to address a couple of questions that have come up while we've been talking. One is, Kelly asks, what if this is systemic? Is that sufficient? One reasonable expectation in many cases, and Brian is going to talk a little bit about this, is for organizations to invest time and energy in getting to the bottom of what happened and answering the question about whether something like this was systemic or not. And that expectation is an expectation that many reasonable people have in many situations. Again, ask the defining question, what would reasonable people expect? And if that includes figure out if this is systemic, then that's likely the right choice to make. Nikki asks about the digital age, and a couple other people asked about social media. The short answer I'd give is that everything Fred and I have described to you stays the same as a matter of practice. What is the structure of the questions you ask yourself? What changes is how quickly it evolves. So the the defining question about stakeholders' expectations stays exactly the same as it was 10 years ago, but I'd say even exactly the same as it was 100 years ago, because it's not about social media, it's about how people relate to organizations and how people form and lose trust, and that's about expectations. So the defining question stays the same. The 4-question test stays the same. The 5 languages of apology stay the same. What's different is that social media can take an incident from being private to being public very fast, can, in other words, trigger that 4-question test much faster. And in that case, it's about being true to the same discipline as has always existed, but being more nimble in how we apply it. And that's the big change in the digital age. Camille asks, officer-involved shootings, would a mayor or leader need to come out right away to apologize? Same thing with respect to expectations. Often those incidents are public or otherwise satisfy the 4-question test that they give us, that if we act quickly, we can shape the outcome, or others are talking about us and expecting us to do or say something now. And those expectations, in the case of an officer-involved shooting, are something that involves death, which we haven't covered in any of our cases so far, generally rise to a very high level. The expectation is for a very senior and very accountable person to be the one who is earning public forgiveness. So, Camille, in the case of an officer-involved shooting, you can apply the same exact structures we've talked about today, but I will say that it's more likely for the issue to be public quickly and for the expectations to be for a higher level authority to take responsibility. Very quickly, let's talk about making this happen before we turn to someone who has made it happen, and that is our guest, Brian Shevlin, the General Counsel of Pernod Ricard USA. And there are lots of organizational considerations. I can imagine many of you already projecting forward to that conversation you have with your organization's crisis team or management committee, and then someone speaks up. And let me guess, it might be the lawyer. Brian is a lawyer. We're going to hear from Brian very shortly, who says, we can't apologize. That'll open us up to legal liability. You saw from our previous cases that there is a relationship between apologies and legal liability, and what each of those 2 cases told us was that the right apology from the right person at the right time could have prevented legal liability altogether. But I want to take a more rigorous look at that question, and that goes back to the University of Michigan Health Center, now almost 20 years ago, did a radical thing. And the radical thing that they did was create a policy for apologizing. At the time, University of Michigan Health Center was bogged down by years and years of backlogs and patient complaints. They were dealing with enormous malpractice suits. They had hundreds of them in court at a given time, and it was beginning to drain resources from the real mission of a university hospital, which is to heal the sick and to teach the next generation of doctors. And instead, they ended up employing a generation of law firms, and they wanted to solve that problem. And so they instituted something called the Michigan Model, which was a policy that whenever they received a complaint, they would review it thoroughly and impartially to assess what happened. This goes back to the idea of investigating to see whether this is systemic or a bigger problem than presents on the surface. And that fulfills an expectation when a patient or a patient's family member complains about care. But the amazing thing here is that the Michigan Model actually writes down that if we conclude our care was unreasonable, we do these things. We apologize. So that's the regret language that we talked about earlier. We take responsibility. We acknowledge that it was our care. We reach agreement about a resolution. That's the restitution piece about making things right. And we make changes. That's the repentance piece about preventing it from happening again. And for all we know, there may have been some more explicit requests for forgiveness, the 5th love language in there somewhere, in some of the ways the doctors are trained to apologize interpersonally. And finally, the Michigan Model says that if a patient persists in a suit over care that our investigation finds was medically appropriate, we will defend our staff with the finest legal team we can assemble. If you're thinking about apologies and legal liability, There's an entire realm of collegiate research on this topic, but if there's one set of data points that is most compelling, it's the results of the Michigan model. In the 8 years after this model was implemented, Michigan Health measured the number of new claims per year, the claims backlog, and the number of claims in litigation. So the number of new claims per year is how many people complain about something new. What they found was that in 8 years, that number got cut in half after the implementation of the Michigan model. Part of that is that doctors were empowered, individual physicians were empowered to apologize earlier and immediately for things that they perceived might have caused harm to a patient. And those patients then didn't even bother to complain because their immediate expectations were met. Part of that is also that as the organization is repenting or getting better, making changes so that this doesn't happen again, it actually prevents future incidents. Now, the claims backlog, the number of claims that are still being processed at a given time in 8 years was cut by 2/3. And the number of claims in litigation that escalated all the way to an open court trial was cut by more than 90% in the same amount of time. Incredible results that led other health systems to adopt models like the Michigan model that empowered frontline employees like physicians to apologize for mistakes, and also set up a systemic policy to review and, when necessary, apologize for mistakes that caused complaints. All of that is about meeting the expectations of people who matter to us. And Michigan found a way systematically, as a matter of policy, to establish a way to meet stakeholders' expectations. It's not that apologizing is the only way to meet stakeholder expectations. In fact, sometimes it's not even a necessary way, but sometimes it is necessary. And Michigan found a way to make it organizationally possible. So that's our advice to you in terms of organizational considerations, is to look at the big picture of risk to the whole enterprise, not just the risk of the apology and the lawsuit, but also the influence that that apology might have on the other individual or the perceived victim. And also to do this work in advance. Like Michigan created the policy, sit down, build these relationships, and have these discussions in advance. And that brings us to someone who knows all about those organizational considerations, how we can make the right decisions in advance, how we can make the right assessments of risk as an organization. We're going to hear not from a communicator, but from a lawyer who knows a lot about communication, and that is Brian Shevlin, the general counsel of Pernod Ricard USA. He'll introduce you a little bit more to who Pernod Ricard is, and you'll probably recognize them. Brian, thank you so much for joining us. We know you have a perspective as a very senior lawyer in a very big organization that a lot of people here can benefit from.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Oh, boy. Thank you, Adam. I'm going to talk about the organizational considerations, specifically around working with your legal function. You'll have to do, and I'm going to try and give you some things to think about so you're well prepared when these things come up. Hope you're not hearing an echo, because I am. Let me introduce myself a little more. I'm General Counsel of Pernod Ricard North America. We're the second largest spirits company in the world. These are the main brands that Pernod Ricard sells around the world. So you recognize a number of them. And when dealing with alcohol beverages across the world, a lot can go wrong. Imagine. It can get crisis related to advertising, not being politically correct, one way or another, the sensitive world that we live in, as well as product liability, activating at events all over the country where alcohol is being served. And we'll talk in a few minutes about a Jameson activation. where we had to deal with a crisis. This page is what I'm showing you is from the U.S. Constitution. And if you haven't seen it before, it's the Sixth Amendment. Now, why do I show this to you? Because it gives two important rights that everyone has that will impact on how you react to a crisis. And they are a right to a jury trial, where you're going to be judged by your peers. And of course, the main criteria is, did you act reasonably under the circumstances? The other right is a right to counsel. It means your right to obtain a lawyer. And it's so fundamental in the United States that you should assume that a victim of anything your company does is definitely going to find a lawyer, or a lawyer will find them. So if something goes wrong, victims and other aggrieved parties are very aware of these rights. We'll come back to this in a moment. But the thing you have to remember is that in any crisis, people will get their day in court, and they will have a lawyer, and you will not be able to avoid that. So what you write, what you say publicly, how you act, is ultimately going to impact your company when you have to settle a lawsuit, or if it goes to trial, get an outcome that's favorable. And a company that acts unreasonably and doesn't follow the golden rules about speaking when the public expects you to speak, or not asking for forgiveness, is going to pay the price down the road. And either the victim is not going to forgive you, or their lawyer will want to stick it to you, or the jury will hold you accountable. Now, there's a couple of organizational issues to keep in mind that I want to go through with you. In addition to, of course, the 5 ways of an effective apology, there are other considerations that I'll take you through in the short time we have left. And they are the attorney-client privilege. Second, maintaining a professional and trusting relationship with your legal counsel. 3, the wording of your apology. 4, the ultimate resolution of the action with the victim through settlement or a court trial. And then your corporate reputation with key stakeholders, NGOs, or government regulators. All of these factors will be impacted by how you seek public forgiveness and how you eventually come out of a crisis situation. And the key thing I want you to remember today, when you deal with your organizations and you go back to deal with a crisis, which will happen, is not to have unforced errors. By that I mean the facts are going to drive any crisis. You'll be confronted with a set of facts that you often can't change, and you'll have to deal with the facts as they are. So managing the game as well as possible and not engaging in any unforced errors should be your objective. So I'm going to first talk about the attorney-client privilege. What this is that any communications between you and your attorney is protected from ever seeing the light of day. That means any oral or written communications, and that includes emails, text messages, are all protected from disclosure in a later proceeding. You'll find that in the immediate aftermath of a bad situation, human beings tend to write very emotional things that may not be true or factually correct, and which can hurt the company or the person later on. So the attorney-client privilege is your best friend. By getting lawyers involved early at your companies as to what happened, how the company should react, all of those communications are protected. So, for example, if a person writes, quote, "This is an absolute disaster. I knew we should have trained the pilots on how to fly the plane," or we knew there were problems with that plane, we flew it anyway, you can see how those statements can hurt you later in front of a jury or in front of the cameras or in explaining that to a victim's family. Plus, I can guarantee you, your legal team will be very unhappy with you because they'll be left holding the bag trying to settle, the case, or trying to convince a jury that the company acted reasonably. So the better advice and the better relationship and the better outcomes will come from getting your lawyer involved early, where you can come up with the proper channels of communication and not say anything that you don't really mean to say. The next point I want to make is just about the stronger relationship you will have with your legal counsel if you follow these rules. You're going to build trust for the future. You're going to have a procedure that you follow, and it'll become second nature when a crisis comes along. And there will not be communications floating around your company that you will regret later. The wording of your apology can be very important. You can still have a very effective apology that mitigates risk for the company, depending on what you say. So, "it was all our fault" is very different than "we feel very bad about what happened to you and we will investigate and get to the bottom of it." And also very different than, "based on our investigation to date, it appears that our people did not follow the rules in this situation." I think they all achieve a similar objective. However, the first one is probably going to be admissible in court, where the last two will not be. Because most states have passed laws that saying that showing compassion or sympathy for a victim is not admissible. It's very, very important to keep that in mind, that statements like this that are given orally when you're talking to the public are written in the appropriate fashion without creating unnecessary risk for the company. The next thing I want to talk about is the resolution with the victims. If you can take the emotion and anger out of it, show remorse, you have a much better chance of minimizing the financial or reputational damage to your company. The Michigan medical example is a good example of how outcomes, monetary damages, etc., can be improved by owning up to the real mistakes and defending situations that should be defended where the standards of care are followed. And as you saw in the examples that Adam gave you, an appropriate apology can sometimes avoid or even mitigate a lawsuit entirely, which most companies simply don't think about. Because the lawyer's normal reaction is any kind of apology is bad. And that's just the wrong instinct. In the end, the lawyer's opinion should not drive the discussion. And I say this as a proud lawyer, but it should just be one voice at the table, because the company reputation can suffer a lot more if you try to get too cute and not really apologize for fear it's going to be used against you later in court. A number of examples that Adam mentioned before made that very clear. When the alleged shoplifter got picked up and said, if they had just called me and apologized, I would not have sued them. The last point I want to make here, before I want to talk about a real life example, is that at the end of the day, when you're sitting at the table with your lawyers, with communications people, your CEO, your CFO, and different folks, enterprise risk is the final decision maker, and you all play your part. And the ultimate question should be is, how do I put my company in the best position to move on from a crisis, the least amount of harm to our enterprise value? And in most cases, an appropriate and timely apology is going to be way more effective in achieving that goal than any legal considerations. But having the lawyer involved will certainly help mitigate the risk when you have to settle and offer restitution to the victims. As there are studies that show that shareholder value, share prices of companies that don't handle crisis properly decline considerably, and the future value of a company is impacted significantly when crises are not handled appropriately. You've probably seen that recently involving WeWork and Uber, where very unsophisticated CEOs and how they are treating their employees and the statements being made to the public did not instill confidence, did not show remorse, and the shareholder value and the ability of those companies to even have effective IPOs is mitigated, causing billions of dollars in shareholder loss. I want to just spend the last 2 minutes talking about a real example that we went through, where because I followed a lot of what Adam spoke about, it helped to mitigate a situation. So we have this event called the Jameson Bartender Ball across the country in major cities, where we invite bartenders to visit us at an account, and we do an education about a new spirit or innovation. And we had an issue in Texas in 2016. Well, a couple of the bartenders who were attending had too much to drink. The event, while branded as the Jameson Bartender Ball, one of our brands, was handled by third-party agencies on behalf of our brand and separate bartender agencies who were serving the guests. The two gentlemen left the bar after having overconsumed, caused an accident resulting in very serious injuries to victims in another car. Remember, this was a Jameson Bartender Ball. So as far as the public was concerned, this was a Jameson event. One of the things we did after being sued was reach out to the plaintiff's family, victim's family, saying how sorry we were. And we did that pretty quickly after the event occurred. That even though we had legal defenses and probably would have been dismissed out of the lawsuit because of the fact that we did not actually serve guys who left the bar, the plaintiff voluntarily dismissed us from the case and continued the case against the other parties. The lesson there was to acknowledge when it's appropriate to say, sorry, this happened, because it was under the Jameson brand. Separate out the legal liability issues from what was the human thing to do. So for me, that was a learning that I'll take into the future of my career, and will certainly be something that I hope you think about when you're confronted with crisis in the future. Thank you very much, and I'll turn it over to Adam to close out the session.
Thank you very much, Brian, and thanks for sharing that personal story as well as your views as a high-ranking lawyer on corporate apologies. What I found particularly striking was the notion that even coming from a lawyer, your view was that the legal voice shouldn't dominate the discussion. It's really important, but it's not only that voice that matters. And I don't say that as a surprising to hear, and I don't say that as a knock against lawyers. I say that as praise for you, because all of us can think in any organization that most people tend to advocate for a bigger voice for themselves. But I think one of the things that's really interesting here is the notion that the best way to protect the enterprise is to give everyone a voice. But Brian, you're right. The only way for the people who are listening today to get their voices heard and to ensure that all voices are heard is to start building relationships now. So let me take just a couple of minutes to respond to some of your questions. Brian, there was a question about FOIA and attorney-client privilege. That's one I'm certainly not qualified to answer. If you have an opinion, please jump in. But first, let's respond to an earlier question from, I believe, Camille, who asked how important is it the apology comes from a person and not just the company. And then, Brian, I might ask you to answer Jake's question about who did the apology from Jameson in this case. So first I'll give my response, and then Brian, if you want to fill in from your story to answer Jake's question.
Yeah, sure.
To the person who asked about whether the apology should come from the person or the company, two considerations. First, again, consider the escalation of expectations over time. So the longer we wait, the higher the apology is going to have to come, and the more likely it is going to have to be from an accountable person, a human being in the organization. The second is to recognize where the harm came from. So if you're Amazon, for example, and someone's package doesn't get delivered, to use a small case, it might not make sense to send a person to their house and apologize because they never did business with a person. They did everything on the internet, and you can send them an email that may not even be attributed to a person. If, on the other hand, you're the mother and son falsely accused of shoplifting in Walgreens, that was done by a human being. So if they go home the next day and then they get an email that doesn't have a person's name on it, it doesn't seem to match the harm that was done to them in the first place. So one thing to consider is that it escalates over time, but the other thing to consider is that the expectation is going to be for the apology to come in a form that's parallel to the harm. And if the harm involved a human, then the apology needs to involve a human. And Brian, let me turn it over to you to answer a little bit more about the Jameson case and how that apology happened.
Yeah, well, it was basically a phone call from the head of our Texas business, who was the highest ranking official in the state of Texas. And they just made a phone call to the victim's family and had a very personal conversation and tried to address some of the steps that you had articulated, Adam, about what we would do in the future to try to make sure that this never happened again at future events. I just wanted to quickly answer the other question on FOIA. The attorney-client privilege supersedes FOIA. So even if there's a request through the Freedom of Information Act, it would not pierce the corporate veil of the attorney-client privilege, and you would not have to turn over that information.
Thank you very much, Brian. I appreciate that. And if
Brian, this is Fred.
Go ahead, Fred.
We're just coming up to the bottom of the hour. Let me take the opportunity to thank both Adam and Brian, and let me commend Adam on the grace with which he recovered from being disconnected from the call and back on the call. We did not have as much time for questions as we had anticipated, but both Adam and Brian have agreed to take questions in writing that we've not been able to get to, and those questions will be responded to in written form, and they will be posted on the community site. I want to thank all of you for participating. There are about 193 people still on the call. Thank you for hanging in with us despite the technical glitch. Next week, we have the challenges and opportunities of social media with Holly Hellstrom from the Logos Institute for Crisis Management and Executive Leadership. Again, Brian, Adam, thank you so much, and thank all of you participants for being part of this. We're now a third of the way through the certificate program, and we look forward to being back with you on next week, and we invite you to continue discussions on the community site. Thank you all very much.